happy St. Patrick's Day. We are going to read you a Celtic fairy tale myth thing. And so, yeah, I'm Blue Aria, and this is Ariel, and she's going to read for us from this book called Celtic Fairy Tales and the Myths.
Did you just lose the page?
No. I have my big finger in it, see? We good. Alright.
The story I'll be reading is called The Daughter of Duart.
Ooh.
There once was a man, Maclean of Duart, who sent his daughter to become a scholar. Now in those days, an education was a novelty for a lassie, but so highly did he think of his daughter that he found the money and sent her away. And a long time she was away too, for it was 3 or 4 years before her feet touched the Maclean soil once more. While she was gone, the man, Maclean of Duart, would sit himself in her room and look around him. It was a fine room. It was for so highly did he think of his daughter that he found the money to buy her everything she ever wanted. There were books of plenty, but since Maclean of Duart could not read, they meant nothing to them. With their drawings of cats and circles and great long poems, there were pictures too on the walls of that room, and a soft cover on the bed. That made it look just so, for there was a clever girl, and she knew how to make a room feel warm. Maclean of Duart was lonely without his daughter, but he carried on working the land, and the day came again when she returned home to him there. And so it was that he took his daughter on his arm and led her up into the hills, where the clouds quivered around them, and their air shone bright and blue. Then they looked around them at all the beauty of the land, and he turned to her, his eyes alight with pride and joy, and he said to his daughter, "How much have you learned?" And his daughter stopped, and she looked about, across the mossy hills to the sea beyond, and there she pointed to a tall ship which fought a course away from them against the waves. "There," she said, "that ship. I have learned enough to bring it to the shore." And her father laughed warmly and took her arm again. He said, "Well then, lass, bring her in." The ship turned then and made its way across the waters towards them, and it kept on coming, as the water grew shallow and the sands rose up to meet it. And then the rocks were there, thrusting their way through the waves as the prow of the ship drew nigh. And the ship kept on coming until it was about to be wrecked on the rocks.
Wow.
Maclean of Duart looked at his daughter then, and he said with a soft voice, "Save them now, lass. Why don't you save them now?" And his daughter shrugged her shoulders, and she smiled an easy smile, then said, "But I can't. I don't know how to do that." There was silence then, filled by the crash of the ship upon the rocks. He turned to her then, did Maclean of Duart, and he laid down her arm. He looked at his daughter with new eyes, and he said to her, "Well then, if that is the education I have bought you, if that is what you have learned, then I would rather your room than your company." He strode home and built a great fire, and when his daughter came in after him, he cut her to bits and burnt her there, saying as he poked the flames, "I will never have you sort in the same place as myself."
Oh my gosh.
And he went to her room and gathered together her books and her pictures and threw them on the fire. Then he took her soft cover from her bed and put that on too, till there was no trace of the girl who was his daughter, for Maclean of Duart thought so highly of his daughter that he could not allow her to practice the education she'd gathered, for he would have nothing to do with black magic, and she had mastered the art.
That was a depressing story.
I honestly didn't know it was going to be that sad.
Okay, we never read this before, that story. I've only read some of the stories in here in the past, and that is the one that I have not heard, so let's read a different one and hope it's happy.
Yeah.
That was an interesting story, though. Very savage.
Okay. Alright.
What's this one called?
I'm gonna read a story called The Horned Woman. Woman.
Interesting.
Okay. A rich woman sat up late one night, carding and preparing wool, while all the family and servants were asleep. Suddenly, a knock was given at the door, and a voice called, "Open, open." "Who is there?" said the woman of the house. "I am the witch of One Horn," was answered. The mistress, supposing that one of her neighbors had called and required assistance, opened the door, and a woman entered, having in her hand a pair of wool carders, and bearing a horn on her forehead, as if growing there. She sat down by the fire in silence and began to card the wool with violent haste. Suddenly she paused and said aloud, "Where are the women? They delay too long." Then a second knock came to the door, and the voices called as before, "Open, open." The mistress felt herself obligated to rise and open the call. And immediately a second witch entered, having 2 horns on her forehead, and in her hand a wheel for the spinning wool. "Give me a place," she said. "I am the witch of 2 horns." And she began to spin as quick as lightning. And so the knocks went on, and the call was heard, and the witches entered, until at last 12 women sat round the fire, the first with 1 horn, and the last with 12 horns. And they carded the thread and turned their spinning wheels, and wound and wove, all singing together in ancient rhyme, but no word did they speak to the mistress of the house. Strange to hear, and frightful to look upon, were these 12 women, with their horns and their wheels, and the mistress felt near to death. And she tried to rise, that she might call for help, but she could not move, nor could she utter a word or a cry, for the spell of the witches was upon her.
Oh.
Then one of them called to her in Irish and said, "Rise, woman, and make us a cake." Then the mistress searched for a vessel to bring water from the well that she might mix the meal and make the cake, but she could find none. And they said to her, "Take a sieve and bring water in it." And she took the sieve and went to the well, but the water poured from it, and she could fetch none for the cake, and she sat down by the well and wept. Then a voice came by her and said, "Take yellow clay and moss, and bind them together, and plaster the sieve so that it will hold." This she did, and the sieve held the water for the cake. And the voice said again, "Return, and when thou comest to the north angle of the house, cry aloud 3 times and say, 'The mountain of Fenian, woman, and the sky over it, it is all on fire.'" And she did so. When the witches inside heard the call, a great and terrible cry broke from their lips, and they rushed forth with wild lamentations and shrieks, and fled away to Slievennemen,
Someplace.
where was their chief abode. But the spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches, if they returned again. And first, to break their spells, she sprinkled the water in which she had washed her child's feet, and the feet water outside the door on the threshold. Secondly, she took the cake which, in her absence, the witches had made of meal mixed with blood drawn from the sleeping family,
Oh.
and she broke the cake
yummy.
in bits, and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took the cloth they had woven, and placed it in half out of the chest with the padlock, and lastly she secured the door with a great crossbeam fastened in jambs, so the witches could not enter, and having done these things she waited. Not long were the witches in coming back, and they raged and called for vengeance. "Open, open," they screamed. "Open, feet water." "I cannot," said the feet water. I am scattered on the ground, and my path is down to low. Open, open, wood and trees and beam, they cried to the door. I cannot, said the door, for the beam is fixed in the jambs, and I have no power to move. Open, open, cake that we have made and mingled with blood. They cried again. I cannot, said the cake, for I am broken and bruised, and my blood is on the lips of the sleeping children. Then the witches rushed through the air with great cries and fled back to Slivniman, uttering strange curses on the spirit of the well, and who had wished their ruin. But the women in the house were left in peace, and the mantle dropped one of the witches in their flight was kept hung up by the mistress in memory of that night. And this mantle was kept by the same family from generation to generation for 500 years after.
Oh, wow.
That one wasn't as sad because the mistress won in the end, and the bad witches were gone.
Exactly. She defeated them with the foot water that she washed. She washed her children's feet with
water.
Is that what it was?
Feet water, I think, was the name of the well spirit.
Oh, the well spirit. Oh, okay. Gotcha. There's one about a Selkie that's a nice story. I don't know. You can find it. It should be under Fae. Where is it? Fairies. You're reading it. It's these little headings. Find the one that says fairies. And there's one about a Selkie.
What is the Selkie one called?
I don't remember. Oh well. Read under Fae. There's some interesting ones that I've heard. This will be our last story for you guys today.
One too long because I don't really like reading. The Fairy Changeling.
Oh, we could hear that one.
Okay. Now I'm gonna read a story called The Fairy Changeling. Okay.
Ooh.
There once was a woman who lived in the sea, where the winds blew cold and damp. By day she combed the sands of seaweed, and by night she lay alone in her bed, weak and lonely. For her husband was a fisherman, and by the light of the moon he trod the rocky coasts, eking a cruel living, but one which kept them fed and warm in a cozy cottage. The woman longed for a child, but it was many years before she was granted her wish, and when her baby finally came, he was small and feeble. His neighbors said he would die, or worse, be snatched by the fairies, who loved a child so fair of complexion, so slight of build. He would be taken, they said, to the land of light, where the fairies danced and sang and played all day, where they set traps and tricks for mortal folk who crossed their merry paths. The fisherman's poor wife could not help but think that a life of laughter would bring roses to the cheeks of her white child, and she wished with all her being that he would be stolen by the fairies and taken to the land where he could become strong. And so it was that fisherman's wife set her child out on the rocks on the edge of her land and watched and waited. She slept for a few moments, but otherwise moved not. And still her baby lay there, swaddled and spiritless, an invitation to the little folk which was not accepted. At length she berated herself for the foolhardy actions and brought her baby into the cottage once more. And there he surprised her by pulling himself up and demanding food, attaching herself to the teat with such relish that she drew back.
Wow.
He suckled the woman dry and then demanded porridge, but still he lay small and wizened, more yellow than before, but so hungry that she could not feed him. So the fisherman's wife placed her baby at her breast and went to see the wise men in the village, anxious about her small but starving baby, frightened by his curious change. The wise man listened carefully to her story, silently shaking his head. "You have not your own baron, but a fairy changeling," he said finally. The wife of the fisherman balked, for there in front of her was the very shape and likeness of her baby, and the cry was as shrill as ever. She refused to believe him. "Take him, then, to your cottage, and leave him in his cradle. Shut the door, but do not go. Spy upon him there, and you will be sure." And so the fisherman's wife returned to her cottage and laid the baby upon his bed, shutting the door firmly behind her, but skulking back to peer in the window. And suddenly her baby sat up and drew from under the mattress a chanter, which he began to play, and instead of her baby there was an old fairy Bodach. She fairly flew back to the wise man and implored him to help her get rid of the changeling, sickened at the thought of having suckled that gnarled old creature. Calmly the wise man took her and told her what to do. The very next day, the wife of the fisherman took her changeling baby and laid him on a rock by the sea, busying herself by collecting seaweed as she did on every day that passed. And comforted by this routine, the baby, or the fairy Bodach, as she not knew he was, fell asleep. And he slept. The tides drew in, licking at the rock on which he slept, until the waters began to dampen his wrappings, and he woke with a start when he realized that he could not reach the fisherman's wife without swimming. He rose to his full height, and a little fairy man, once more he began to stamp his feet and howl, shaking his fists at the fisherman's wife, who stood entranced as the waters threatened to engulf the fierce fairy.
Oh, dang.
And so it was that 10 or 12 small fairies appeared to rescue their kin. But since fairies cannot swim, they danced helplessly on the shore, while the waters grew higher and higher about the rock.
Oh.
The fisherman's wife was smug, and she said, "I shall leave him there until you return my baby."
Oh, smart.
And the fairies disappeared and returned with her baby, who had grown in his time away from his mother, and whose cheeks were roses, whose white skin held the bloom of good health, and she thanked the fairies and returned their Bodach to them. So the fisherman's wife, flushed with her good fortune, went back to her cozy cottage, protected from the winds which blew cold and damp from the sea. She lived there with the blossoming baby, by day combing the sands for seaweed, and at night nestling warm in her bed with her son, silently thanking the little people who had made him strong.
Oh, that's a good story. That one had a happy ending.
I guess in the beginning she wanted them to take her baby to make him strong and stuff.
Yep.
But then when they replaced him, she wasn't happy about that.
No.
So she wanted her baby back.
She didn't want that wrinkly old man fairy. That is freaky.
Yeah. The wrinkly old man fairy drank from her teeth.
Gross. I mean, I'd be disturbed too, like. Oh.
Yeah.
No, those are good stories. Well, thanks for listening with us. And
sorry for my terrible reading.
I thought it was good. I mean,
messed up a lot.
You were good. I mean, I suck worse at reading. That's why I brought her. Anyway. So yeah, if you have any fun St. Patrick's plans, leave them in the comments. Be cool to hear what you guys have planned. We're gonna eat corned beef and cabbage and potatoes.
Yeah.
Yep. And just stick around at home. But yeah, happy St. Patrick's Day, and we'll see you next time. Bye.